The dim light of a medieval chamber flickered against the cold stone walls, and on a wooden table lay instruments that looked more suited for a butcher than a healer. Rusted knives, crude saws, and iron hooks gleamed faintly in the candlelight. They were not sterilized, not cleaned, not even properly cared for. To place yourself in the hands of a physician in the Middle Ages was not to step into a place of healing, but into a space where danger lurked behind every movement. Medicine, in that time, was not an art of saving lives, but often a gamble of survival, where the tools themselves could bring death faster than the illness. Imagine walking into a small town infirmary, your leg wounded after a farming accident. The physician would examine the gash with bare hands, hands that had touched dozens of sick bodies before yours. The knife he used to scrape away the damaged flesh was the same knife that had carved into someone with the plague earlier that week. Rust clung to the blade, not only threatening infection, but ensuring that tetanus or blood poisoning would almost certainly follow. There were no disinfectants, no concept of germs, no sterilization by fire or boiling water. The very tools that were meant to heal were instead silent carriers of death, turning even the most routine procedures into potential executions. As you sit there listening to these echoes of the past, I invite you to stay with me on this journey by subscribing, so you don't miss the stories that are yet to unfold. And tell me, in the comments, what time is it where you're watching right now? I want to know the hour from which your voice joins this story. The rust alone was enough to seal a fate. In modern terms, we understand rusted iron as a breeding ground for bacteria like Clostridium tetani, which causes agonizing muscle spasms and suffocation. But medieval doctors had no knowledge of microbes. If a patient developed a fever or violent convulsions days after treatment, it was not blamed on poor hygiene, but on imbalances of humors, bad air, or even sins of the soul. What could have been prevented with something as simple as heat or alcohol cleansing was left to superstition and ignorance, and the patient was left to rot slowly from within. The horror deepened when you realized these tools were not exclusive to one patient. The same iron hook used to pull a tooth might later be applied to open a wound in the chest. Blood crusted on the edges was sometimes wiped with a cloth, but often left until it wore away with time. The barber surgeons, who doubled as both hair cutters and medical practitioners, moved seamlessly from shaving a man's beard to amputating a soldier's leg, using blades that carried remnants of one client into the body of another. The distinction between healer and butcher blurred into something almost indistinguishable, and trust in their hands was an act of blind desperation. The environment in which these procedures were performed was no less nightmarish. A patient lay on a wooden board, sweat and blood soaking into the grain of the table. Flies buzzed overhead, drawn to the iron smell of fresh wounds, while candles sputtered in the stale air. Every cut, every slice of the blade was felt fully, nerves screaming as the body trembled against makeshift restraints. Yet even in agony, one had to hope that the knife would do more good than harm. But how could it? When infection lingered in every corner of the room, when splinters of wood and flakes of iron sometimes slipped into the wound itself? Curiously, there are accounts of physicians boasting about their instruments, as if their collection of knives and saws was a mark of expertise. In reality, these tools often shorten lives rather than saving them. A noble who could afford a physician's visit might leave the room thinking he was safe, only to collapse days later with sepsis spreading through his veins. Peasants, lacking access to such care, often fared better simply because they relied on natural remedies or allowed wounds to heal uncut. Survival was not about skillful healing, but luck, chance, and sometimes the mercy of avoiding the doctor altogether. The trust placed in these men was both tragic and inevitable. When illness struck, what choice did people have? To turn away from the only figure who carried the promise of knowledge would mean surrendering to disease without a fight. To step into his hands was to risk death, but to refuse his help was to face it anyway. The figure of the medieval doctor stood as both savior and executioner, a man whose very presence was a paradox of hope and despair. And yet, despite the dangers, people lined up at their doors, carrying wounds from wars, infections from childbirth, or broken bones from daily labor. Each patient believed they might be the fortunate one who survived the knife. Each family prayed their loved one would return home healed, not shrouded. The fear of the illness outweighed the fear of the blade, and so the cycle continued, with rusted tools carving history one scream at a time. It is chilling to imagine that in those moments, the greatest threat to life was not the disease itself, but the cure. And as we picture the doctor setting aside his knife, blood still dripping onto the floor, we realize the horror had only begun, for the next patient was already waiting at the door, clutching their wound, unaware that the instruments awaiting them had already claimed countless lives before. In the world of medieval healing, there was one creature that came to symbolize both hope and horror: the leech. To understand the role of the leech in medicine is to step into a realm where the boundaries between cure and cruelty blurred, where the line between relief and death was so fine that it could not be seen until it was already too late. For centuries, physicians believed that nearly every ailment, whether it was a fever, a headache, melancholy, or even madness, could be treated by draining blood from the body, and the leech, small and seemingly harmless, became the universal key to unlocking this supposed cure. Imagine walking into a physician's chamber with a pounding migraine. Instead of rest or herbs, you would find your arm submerged in a bowl of water where dozens of writhing black leeches floated, waiting. The doctor would let them latch onto your skin, their tiny jaws slicing through flesh with microscopic teeth, their saliva numbing the pain while releasing anticoagulants to keep the blood flowing freely. To the physician, each drop that left your body was a victory against imbalance, a step closer to health. But what he could not see, what he refused to accept, was that this very act often pushed the patient toward weakness, fainting, or death. The practice was built on the ancient theory of humors, the belief that the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Sickness was seen as nothing more than an excess of one of these. Blood, being the most visible and easiest to access, became the prime target for correction. If a man was too hot, too restless, or too emotional, physicians claimed he was overfull of blood. The solution was to bleed him until balance was restored. In truth, what often followed was dizziness, collapse, or worse, a complete inability of the body to fight the very illness that had brought him there in the first place. One of the most chilling aspects was the sheer scale of the bleeding. There are accounts of patients losing not a few drops, but entire bowls of blood in a single session. In some cases, leeches alone could drain nearly a pint before falling off, swollen to several times their normal size. Doctors would encourage this, praising the leeches as if they had sucked out evil itself. For the patient, however, recovery was rarely guaranteed. A noble suffering from fever might never rise again from his bed. His body left too weak to withstand the treatment that was meant to save him. The irony is that leeches did, on rare occasions, produce relief. Patients with hypertension or swollen limbs sometimes felt lighter after blood was drained, and this gave physicians the illusion that the practice worked. Word of these small successes spread, reinforcing the idea that bleeding was a universal cure. What the people did not realize was that these moments of improvement were exceptions, not rules. And for every patient who walked out of the physician's house feeling better, many more were carried out lifeless. The popularity of leeches grew to such an extent that entire economies formed around their trade. In medieval Europe, professional leech gatherers waded into marshes and ponds, often using their own legs as bait. They allowed the creatures to latch on by the dozens, then peeled them off to sell to physicians and apothecaries. Many of these gatherers developed chronic infections and scars that never fully healed, but the demand was so great that the practice became a profession in its own right. In some cities, jars filled with live leeches sat on shelves like prized commodities, their wriggling bodies ready to be applied at a moment's notice. Even royalty was not spared from this obsession. Records tell of kings and queens submitting to leech therapy for everything from indigestion to hysteria. One French king reportedly underwent bleeding so frequently that his health deteriorated to the point of permanent weakness. Yet the court physicians continued their work, convinced that removing more blood was the only way to restore vitality. The tragedy lay not in their cruelty, but in their ignorance, in the stubborn belief that draining life from the body could ever restore it. But beyond the physical suffering, there was also the psychological terror. To sit still while leeches clung to your skin, to watch them grow fat with your blood, was a test of endurance as much as treatment. Children cried in horror, women fainted at the sight, and men gritted their teeth while feeling the cold, slimy pull of the creatures feeding on them. Some patients tried to resist, begging the physician to stop, but refusal often meant being branded as foolish or sinful, unwilling to let the cure work. The grip of this practice on medieval society reveals more than medical ignorance. It exposes the desperation of people living in constant fear of disease. Plagues, fevers, and mysterious illnesses had no real cures, and so any method that promised even a flicker of hope was seized with both hands. Better to risk weakness from blood loss, they thought, than to face the unknown terror of an illness left untreated. The leech, grotesque as it was, became a symbol of that fragile hope, a living embodiment of humanity's attempt to control the uncontrollable. And yet, with every patient who left paler and weaker than before, with every noble who collapsed after yet another bleeding session, whispers began to form. People wondered if the cure was truly worse than the disease. They questioned whether their faith in these creatures was misplaced, whether the physician himself was not a healer but a silent executioner. This doubt, growing slowly, would eventually force medicine to evolve. But before that evolution, countless lives were lost, drained not only by sickness, but by the very hands they trusted to save them. The candlelight trembled against the rough stone walls as a patient was dragged into the chamber, his cries echoing in the stillness of the night. A deep wound gaped across his thigh, blood soaking the ragged cloth tied hastily around it. The physician, or rather the barber surgeon, nodded calmly and reached for his instruments, knives dulled from constant use, bone saws that reeked of iron and old blood, and needles that had long lost their sharpness. There was no preparation, no cleansing, no anesthetic. to shield the man from what was about to come. Pain was not an unfortunate side effect of surgery in the Middle Ages. It was the essence of the procedure itself. Patients were often bound tightly with leather straps, or held down by assistants while the surgeon worked. Every cut was felt in excruciating detail, nerves screaming as flesh was sliced and bone was exposed. Without anesthesia, the body reacted violently, twisting, jerking, sometimes even breaking restraints in desperate attempts to flee the blade. It was not uncommon for patients to faint from the agony, only to be revived with cold water or sharp slaps, just so the surgeon could continue his grim task. In many cases, fainting was a blessing, a temporary escape from the torment until consciousness cruelly returned. Operations were performed by the flickering light of candles or oil lamps, their dim glow barely illuminating the blood-stained instruments. Shadows danced on the walls, creating an almost theatrical setting where life and death were decided in moments. The surgeon relied not on knowledge of anatomy, but on brute force and instinct. To remove a rotting limb was to cut as quickly as possible, sawing through flesh and bone while the patient screamed so loudly that neighbors could hear from the streets. Success was measured not by precision, but by speed. The faster the cut, the greater the chance the patient might survive the pain-induced shock. But even survival during the surgery was no guarantee of a life afterward. Infection loomed like a specter over every wound. The saw that had just amputated one man's gangrenous foot might be used moments later on another's shattered arm. Blood carried diseases from one body to the next, and pus-filled infections blossomed within days, spreading through the bloodstream until fever and delirium consumed the victim. In some cases, the stench of rotting flesh returned before the wound even closed, a sign that death was already inside the body. The surgeon might attempt another amputation, cutting higher and higher, but often the effort only prolonged the inevitable. There are records of battlefield surgeries where men were lined up in rows, their limbs hacked off one by one, their cries blending into a single dreadful chorus. Surgeons worked with hands slick with blood, wiping them on aprons already saturated with gore. Assistants carried buckets filled with severed arms and legs, discarded like scraps of meat. The floor became so slippery with blood that straw had to be thrown down to soak it up. In these gruesome scenes, the surgeon's chamber or battlefield tent resembled less a place of healing and more a slaughterhouse. Yet despite the horror, surgery was sometimes the only option. A broken bone left untreated could cripple a man for life, and a festering wound could spread poison through the body. Patients willingly submitted themselves to the knife, clinging to the hope of survival, even knowing that agony awaited them, and sometimes, miraculously, they did survive. A leg amputated in time might save a soldier from dying of infection, and a crude trepanation, a hole drilled into the skull, could relieve the pressure of a head injury. These rare successes, however, only reinforced the belief that such brutal methods were the path to healing, blinding people to the countless deaths that far outnumbered the recoveries. Stories passed through villages of men who endured surgeries so savage that they became legends. One tale speaks of a peasant who had his arm sawn off while still conscious, his screams shaking the rafters of the surgeon's hut, yet he lived long enough to return to the fields months later. Another tells of a noble woman whose breast was cut away to remove a tumor, her attendants fainting at the sight of the procedure, but her survival celebrated as a miracle. These stories became part of the cultural fabric, reinforcing the image of pain as a test of endurance, of agony as the price one must pay for life. It is chilling to imagine how common these scenes were, how normalized the screams of patients became. To live in the Middle Ages was to accept that medical care meant suffering beyond comprehension, and that healing was often indistinguishable from torture. Families stood outside the chamber, listening to the cries of their loved ones, praying that the sound would eventually fade into silence, not because death had claimed them, but because they had survived the ordeal. And as the surgeon placed his blood-soaked saw back on the table, ready for the next patient, the air itself seemed heavy with dread. For in a world lit only by flickering candles and ruled by ignorance, the terror of surgery was only one part of a much darker reality. A reality where the very air and touch of the healer could bring death in ways even more insidious. The greatest enemy of a medieval patient was not always the wound itself, nor the surgeon's crude knife, but something far more invisible and merciless: infection. In a world without antibiotics, without knowledge of germs, and without even the most basic concept of sterilization, every medical procedure was a silent gamble against microscopic killers no one could see or understand. To live in the Middle Ages was to know that even the smallest cut could transform into a sentence of death, and that the same physician who offered hope might unknowingly deliver doom. Consider the fate of a man who survived a brutal amputation. The surgeon's saw had done its work, slicing away the infected limb with astonishing speed, and the patient, writhing in pain, had endured the unthinkable. But in the days that followed, a new enemy emerged. The wound, hastily bound with rough linen, began to throb with heat. The edges reddened, pus oozed, and the smell of decay filled the air. Fever set in, the body shivering with chills, until delirium clouded the mind. What the surgeon believed to be the body rebalancing itself was, in truth, the spread of sepsis, a flood of bacteria racing through the blood, overwhelming every defense. Within a week, the man was dead, not from his injury, but from the infection born of the very act that was meant to save him. This was no isolated story. It was the fate of thousands. Physicians moved from one patient to another with hands still stained in blood, wiping them on aprons that were never washed. Instruments, caked with layers of dried flesh and rust, were passed from case to case. In battlefields, where the wounded lay in rows, surgeons worked tirelessly, hacking through limbs with the same saw again and again, never once pausing to clean it. Each cut carried with it the remnants of the last man's suffering, spreading unseen killers through every wound. The result was inevitable. Infection ran rampant, claiming far more lives than the original injuries ever could. Even childbirth, a moment meant to bring new life, became one of the most dangerous experiences for women. Midwives and physicians, having touched one mother's blood, would move to the next without washing their hands, unknowingly passing deadly bacteria that caused puerperal fever. Entire wards of mothers died after giving birth, their bodies consumed by infections that could have been prevented with nothing more than soap and clean water. Yet, in the medieval mind, these deaths were explained not by hygiene, but by curses, bad luck, or divine punishment. What is striking is how people attempted to explain the unexplainable. Physicians, bound to the theory of humors, believed that infections were the body's attempt to purge excess fluids. Pus, to them, was a sign of healing rather than decay. When a wound swelled and oozed, they called it laudable pus, proof that the body was expelling corruption. Patients were told to endure the pain, to let the body cleanse itself, even as the infection spread beyond control. The belief was so ingrained that for centuries, doctors celebrated pus rather than feared it, never realizing they were watching death take hold before their very eyes. Some physicians attempted desperate remedies. They applied mixtures of herbs, honey or vinegar to festering wounds, hoping to draw out the bad humors. At times, these treatments accidentally worked. Honey, for example, does have natural antibacterial properties, but such success was rare and inconsistent, drowned out by the overwhelming tide of death. More often, remedies involved animal dung, moldy bread, or powders of ground bones, substances that only fed infection further. A patient who might have survived a simple cut instead succumbed after being treated with filth rubbed directly into the wound. Fear of infection shaped how people lived and died. There are accounts of communities shunning surgeons after outbreaks, whispering that they carried curses or evil spirits. Others clung to their doctors desperately, convinced that only their knowledge could save them, even as survival rates plummeted. The paradox was inescapable. To seek help was to risk death, but to avoid it was to surrender to disease without a fight. For families, every decision was a gamble, and every wound was a potential funeral. One particularly grim reality was that physicians themselves were not immune. Surrounded by illness, touching plague victims, inhaling the air of rotting wounds, they often fell sick alongside their patients. A surgeon who prided himself on saving others could collapse days later with the same fever that had killed his patients. Their apprentices, young men eager to learn, often perished before mastering their craft, taken by the infections they had only just begun to study. The profession of healing, in many ways, was a death sentence disguised as duty. What makes these stories even more haunting is how common they were. Villagers expected wounds to fester, mothers to die in childbirth, soldiers to fall not from battle but from infection afterward. Death was so interwoven with medical care that it became part of life's rhythm, a grim acceptance that healing and dying often came hand in hand. And yet, despite the terror, people continued to trust, continued to hope, because to abandon faith in the physician was to face despair alone. It is almost unbearable to imagine the helplessness of lying in a dark chamber, fever burning through the body, the smell of rotting flesh filling the room, while the doctor insists that the pus spilling from your wound is a good sign. The family gathers, whispering prayers, clinging to hope, but deep down everyone knows what is coming. The patient grows weaker, his breath more shallow, until silence takes the place of his cries. The infection, unseen and unstoppable, has claimed another life. And still, the world moved on. The surgeon cleaned his hands on the same bloody apron, picked up the same unwashed knife, and turned to the next patient waiting at the door. In that moment, hope and horror collided once more, for those outside had no idea that stepping across the threshold meant stepping into the arms of death disguised as a healer. In the medieval world, medicine was rarely guided by logic or observation, but by superstition and faith, woven tightly into every corner of daily life. Physicians and healers alike believed that the body was not governed solely by physical laws, but by forces invisible, mysterious, and often divine. To fall ill was not simply to suffer from disease, it was to become entangled in a struggle between heavenly favor and demonic influence. The sick were seen not only as patients, but as vessels through which unseen powers expressed their will. And the remedies they were subjected to reflected this worldview, where prayer often outweighed knowledge and rituals replaced science. Step into a medieval physician's chamber, and you might find not only herbs and ointments, but also relics of saints, crosses, and small charms meant to drive away spirits. A man suffering from fever could be given a mixture of plants boiled in wine, but alongside it, he might be instructed to wear an amulet containing a passage of scripture. A woman struggling with convulsions might be bled until she collapsed from weakness, then laid before a priest to have prayers chanted over her, the illness blamed on the devil's grip. For every herb applied, there was an equal measure of incantation, because medicine was not viewed as separate from religion. It was religion in practice, cloaked in the body's suffering. Astrology, too, held immense power over diagnosis and treatment. Physicians often consulted the stars before deciding how to act. The alignment of planets was believed to determine whether bloodletting would succeed, whether surgery would kill or heal, even whether a child would survive the night. Entire charts were drawn up, marking the influence of celestial bodies on different parts of the body. If Mars ruled over the head, then an injury there could only be treated when the planet's position was favorable. Imagine lying feverish in your bed while your doctor gazed not at your wound, but at the sky, waiting for the stars to shift before lifting a finger. Superstitions bled into every practice. It was common to believe that carrying a toad in a pouch could cure plague, or that tying herbs around the neck would drive out fevers. Some healers advised swallowing powdered emeralds, believing the precious stone had the power to cleanse the blood. Others relied on rituals that bordered on magical performance, writing prayers on strips of parchment and soaking them in water for the patient to drink, or whispering charms while placing animal parts on the body. These practices were not seen as foolish, but as deeply respected traditions, passed down through generations as if sacred knowledge. The reliance on superstition was not entirely the fault of the healers. In a world where plagues wiped out entire towns overnight, where childbirth could kill even the healthiest women, and where wounds so often turned fatal, people needed explanations. Without knowledge of germs, bacteria, or the immune system, invisible forces were the only reasonable culprits. Illness was punishment for sins, a curse from an enemy, or an omen of misfortune to come. When nothing made sense, superstition gave people something to cling to, a fragile thread of hope in the face of chaos. There were moments when these beliefs intersected with actual medical relief. Burning herbs to cleanse the air while rooted in superstition sometimes reduced the spread of infection by fumigating homes. Honey applied to wounds, recommended as part of ancient rituals, occasionally prevented infection due to its natural antibacterial properties. Yet these successes were accidental, not understood, and often overshadowed by far more dangerous practices. For every treatment that helped, there were countless others that poisoned, weakened, or outright killed those who placed their trust in them. Perhaps the most striking example of superstition in medicine was the role of relics. Pilgrims traveled great distances to touch bones of saints or vials of holy water, believing these objects could cure ailments that no physician could. Cathedrals filled with the desperate and the dying, each pressing coins into the hands of priests for the chance at healing. The line between faith and exploitation blurred, with spiritual leaders often profiting from the suffering of the masses. In these sacred spaces, the hope of divine intervention replaced any attempt at practical medicine, and those who returned unhealed were told their faith had simply not been strong enough. At times, superstition turned deadly. When outbreaks spread, scapegoats were hunted. Entire communities were accused of bringing disease through witchcraft or heresy. Women who practiced herbal healing were branded as witches, their knowledge condemned as dangerous sorcery. Instead of being celebrated as pioneers of natural remedies, many were executed, their wisdom lost in flames. The fear of the unknown fed paranoia, and rather than seeking truth, society sought blame, deepening the suffering of the sick while silencing voices that might have brought genuine progress. What is haunting is how deeply people believed in these practices, how unshakable their faith was in charms, relics, and rituals. A man could be dying of sepsis, his body riddled with infection, and still his family would place a cross around his neck, convinced that faith alone would banish the illness. A child coughing blood would be surrounded not by clean air or medicine, but by whispered prayers and the smoke of burning herbs. Hope was shaped into ritual, and ritual became the medicine of an age that understood so little yet clung so fiercely to belief. And while superstition offered comfort, it also chained progress. By placing more trust in the stars than in observation, more faith in charms than in knowledge, medieval medicine remained trapped in a cycle of ignorance. It took centuries before science began to peel away the layers of superstition, before reason started to replace ritual. But in the dim chambers of the Middle Ages, where every illness was seen as a curse and every cure as a prayer, the line between healing and harming was as fragile as the candlelight that flickered against the stone walls. It is in this unsettling intersection of faith and fear that we see not only the failures of medieval medicine, but the desperation of a people who could not yet comprehend the truth. And while superstition ruled the sick room, other forces were waiting outside its door, forces that would prove just as dangerous, where ignorance and fear collided with power, and even the act of healing could be twisted into a crime. To be a physician in the Middle Ages was not only to fight disease and infection, it was to walk a thin line between healer and heretic. In an age where religion dominated every corner of life, even the act of curing someone could be twisted into a dangerous accusation. Knowledge itself was suspect. Those who dared to study the human body too closely, who sought answers beyond the authority of Scripture, risked more than professional failure. They risked their lives. Consider the plight of a healer who experimented with herbs not sanctioned by the church. If his remedies succeeded, he might be praised as gifted. But if his patient died, or if his methods looked unusual, whispers could begin. Was he practicing sorcery? Was his knowledge given by God or by the devil? The line was so blurred that a successful cure could spark admiration one day and accusations of witchcraft the next. It was not enough to heal. One had to heal in the right way, under the approving eye of religious authority, or else face suspicion. The Inquisition cast a long shadow over medicine. Physicians were required to conform to dogma, to root their explanations of illness not in observation, but in theology. Sickness was often described as punishment for sin or the result of demonic influence. Those who questioned this narrative risked being seen as defying the church itself. Some were interrogated, tortured, and executed. Others lived in constant fear, concealing their curiosity, hiding their experiments, and passing knowledge in secret manuscripts that could cost them everything if discovered. One of the most haunting examples was the treatment of women who practiced healing. Many midwives and herbalists had inherited generations of folk knowledge, how to use willow bark for pain or certain plants to ease childbirth. But their remedies, effective though they might be, carried a terrible risk. As soon as rumors of witchcraft spread, the same women who had delivered children safely for decades could be dragged into public squares, accused of consorting with the devil. Their knowledge, instead of being celebrated, was burned with them, lost in the flames of superstition and fear. There are chilling accounts of physicians themselves falling victim to these tides. A doctor who attempted to dissect a corpse to learn anatomy could be branded as a heretic for desecrating the body. Even if done in secret, discovery could mean imprisonment or execution. This fear strangled progress. While in distant lands, scholars were advancing medicine. In Europe, knowledge was shackled by the weight of suspicion. It was safer to recite ancient texts unquestioningly than to observe with one's own eyes. Safer to cling to Galen's outdated theories than to propose new ideas that might anger powerful authorities. The paradox was cruel. Society demanded physicians, yet often punished them for their very expertise. A noble family might summon a doctor to treat a mysterious illness, and if the patient improved, the doctor would be rewarded. But if the patient worsened, the same doctor could be accused of poisoning or witchcraft. Healers became scapegoats for fate itself, blamed for outcomes beyond their control. Many lived under constant anxiety, knowing that every decision carried not just the weight of life and death for the patient, but also for themselves. Some physicians attempted to protect themselves by blending medicine with ritual. They might begin a treatment with prayers, invoke the names of saints, or perform small blessings to prove their loyalty to faith. This performance was as much a shield as a belief, a way to reassure both patient and church that their work was holy. Behind closed doors, however, some continued to experiment, to test new methods, to quietly advance their craft in ways that would not be seen until centuries later. These secret acts of defiance, though hidden, planted the seeds for the medical revolutions to come. The atmosphere of suspicion extended far beyond the physician's chamber. Entire towns could turn against a healer if disease spread. During outbreaks, it was not unusual for panicked communities to accuse doctors of spreading illness intentionally, of being in league with unseen forces. Fear turned to anger, and anger turned to violence. Some doctors were driven from towns, their homes destroyed, their lives ended by mobs desperate to blame someone for their suffering. In these moments, the healer became as vulnerable as the sick, a victim of the very fear he was meant to soothe. What is most unsettling is how fragile trust truly was. A doctor could be praised as a miracle worker one month and condemned the next, depending on nothing more than chance. If his patient lived, he was favored by God. If his patient died, he was touched by the devil. This uncertainty made medicine as perilous for the practitioner as for the patient. To heal was not only to fight disease, but to navigate the unpredictable tides of superstition, politics, and faith that could turn against you without warning. And so, many physicians chose safety over progress. They repeated the same ineffective treatments, performed the same rituals, and clung to tradition not because they believed it worked, but because it kept them alive. Innovation became an act of rebellion. Curiosity became a crime, and while a few dared to push forward in the shadows, the rest walked carefully along the narrow path laid before them, praying each day that their work would not draw the wrong kind of attention. It is haunting to imagine the fear of a physician in those days, standing over a sickbed, knowing that every word he spoke and every movement he made could be twisted into evidence against him. His tools, his knowledge, even his intent could be seen as holy or heretical, salvation or sorcery. And, as he whispered a prayer to protect himself as much as his patient, he must have known deep inside that the most dangerous disease of all was not the one in the body before him, but the ignorance and suspicion that poisoned the very society he served. The arrival of the plague in medieval Europe was not only a health crisis, but a living nightmare that stripped away every illusion of safety and exposed the fragility of human life. For physicians, it was the ultimate trial by fire. No amount of ritual, bleeding, or prayer could stop the tide of death that swept across entire continents. The Black Death, as it came to be known, descended like a shadow over towns and villages, spreading faster than reason, killing so efficiently that even the most seasoned healers stood powerless. To practice medicine in that time was to stare into an abyss that swallowed both patients and doctors alike. The plague appeared suddenly, often with terrifying speed. One day, a man might feel healthy, and the next he would collapse with fever, his body erupting in swollen black buboes that oozed pus and blood. Physicians rushed to treat him, but their remedies, leeches, lancing the boils, or endless bloodletting, did nothing. Within days, sometimes even hours, the patient was gone. What haunted doctors most was not only the swiftness of death, but the certainty of it. Once the signs appeared, survival was almost impossible. The plague did not discriminate between rich or poor, noble or peasant, healer or healed. It took everyone. The famous image of the plague doctor with his bird-like mask tells its own chilling story. The mask, filled with herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloths, was designed to protect against miasma, the poisoned air believed to spread disease. Doctors walked the streets like grotesque birds of death, long black robes covering their bodies, canes in their hands to prod the sick without touching them. To the terrified public, they were both symbols of hope and harbingers of doom. The sight of one approaching meant the plague was near, and few would live long after their visit. Despite their strange attire, the plague doctors were not safe. Many of them still fell victim, infected through the very patients they tried to heal. Their masks, now iconic, offered little real protection against the fleas and rats that carried the true killers. Infected sores on their hands, sudden fevers, and coughing blood were as common among doctors as among those they treated. Whole communities of healers perished, leaving towns defenseless. Families sometimes barricaded themselves inside their homes, locking doors not just against the sick, but also against the doctors themselves, fearing that their presence brought more danger than relief. Desperation gave rise to extremes. Some physicians recommended bizarre remedies, such as bathing in vinegar, drinking crushed emeralds mixed with wine, or applying the blood of animals directly to the skin. Others resorted to superstition, prescribing prayers, pilgrimages, or the wearing of charms. One account even describes a treatment where patients were advised to inhale the stench of human waste, under the belief that stronger foul smells would drive away the pestilential air. Of course, none of these worked, but in a time of terror, people clung to anything that promised the faintest chance of survival. And yet, perhaps the most terrifying aspect was how the plague transformed the role of the physician itself. Many abandoned their patients entirely, fleeing towns before the disease could reach them. Others charged exorbitant fees, exploiting the desperation of families who would pay anything to save a loved one. Those who stayed faced impossible odds. For every person who recovered, whether by luck or natural immunity, hundreds more died. Hope dwindled with each body cart that rolled down the street, piled high with the dead, accompanied by the haunting cry, "Bring out your dead." Physicians could do nothing but watch as their communities dissolved into chaos and despair. In some cities, the bodies were so numerous that physicians stopped even attempting to treat the sick. Their work shifted from healing to recording symptoms, documenting the horrors in hopes that future generations might understand. It was in this era that some of the first attempts at epidemiology emerged. Crude observations noting how quickly the disease spread, how entire households fell within days, how proximity to rats or certain neighborhoods seemed to make matters worse. Even so, these insights offered little comfort in the face of overwhelming death. The psychological toll on physicians was immense. To enter a house filled with the dying, to see families rotting in their own beds, to smell the stench of death in every street, was to carry trauma that no prayer could cleanse. Some doctors wrote of losing their faith entirely, questioning how a just God could unleash such horror. Others became hardened, moving from body to body without emotion, their compassion buried under layers of exhaustion and despair. For them, the plague was not only a disease of the body, but a corruption of the spirit, a slow erosion of humanity itself. Still, amidst the despair, there were moments of desperate innovation. Some towns began to experiment with quarantine, locking ships in harbors for 40 days before allowing passengers to disembark. Physicians supported these measures, not because they understood germs, but because they observed that isolation seemed to slow the spread. It was a small spark of progress in an otherwise dark time, one that hinted at a future where reason might eventually replace superstition. But for those who lived through it, the plague reshaped medicine forever. It exposed the utter helplessness of medieval physicians, stripping away the illusions of leeches and bloodletting, and forcing society to confront the limits of its knowledge. More than anything, it showed that the doctor was as vulnerable as the patient, that the cloak of authority could not shield him from the same fate. In that realization lay a deep, unsettling truth. Medicine was not a fortress, but a fragile candle flickering in the storm. And as the plague doctors vanished one by one, their masks left hanging in empty chambers, the people of Europe were left with a chilling question. If neither prayers nor physicians could save them, what power, if any, was left to protect them from the next wave of death that loomed just beyond the horizon? To speak of medieval medicine is to speak of blood, not because blood carried life, but because physicians believed it was the source of nearly every illness, and draining it was the universal cure. The theory of humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was the compass by which doctors navigated the human body. Of these, blood was considered dominant, the most dangerous when in excess, the easiest to release. And so, for centuries, physicians reached instinctively for knives, cups, and leeches, convinced that salvation lay in letting life flow out of their patients. Picture a feverish man trembling in his bed, sweat soaking through the sheets. His family calls the physician, who enters with calm authority and a pouch of instruments. He inspects the patient briefly, feels his pulse, then declares with certainty, "The blood is too hot." No discussion of germs or infection, no attempt to understand the real cause. Instead, the cure is simple and brutal. The man's arm is tied, a vein is cut, and warm blood pours into a waiting bowl. Relief is promised, balance restored. But as the color drains from his face and his breathing weakens, the question lingers, was he cured or simply bled to death? The scale of this practice is staggering. Bloodletting was prescribed for nearly everything: headaches, fevers, pneumonia, childbirth complications, even mental illness. Children were bled for growth issues, soldiers for battle wounds, nobles for melancholy. There are accounts of patients being drained multiple times in a single week, sometimes until they collapsed. Physicians measured their success not by survival, but by how much blood they had removed, believing that weakness was proof the disease had been purged. It was not uncommon for several pints to be taken at once, a volume that would leave the strongest man reeling and the weakest beyond recovery. The tools themselves added to the terror. Lancets, small, sharp knives, were used to pierce veins quickly, the blood spurting into cups as attendants held the patient down. Cupping glasses, heated and pressed against the skin, created suction that drew blood to the surface, leaving angry red welts and bruises. Scarificators, spring-loaded boxes of blades, could slice multiple cuts at once, releasing streams of blood that soaked through cloth. To the patient, each device looked more like a weapon of torture than an instrument of healing, and in truth, the difference was not always clear. Despite the risks, the practice became so ingrained in society that even the most powerful rulers submitted to it. Kings and emperors, surrounded by the best physicians of their age, were bled for ailments both minor and severe. One French king is recorded to have undergone so many bloodlettings during a fever that he barely survived the treatment itself. The tragedy was repeated across Europe. The higher the status of the patient, the more aggressively they were treated, as if draining more blood would demonstrate the physician's skill and devotion. In reality, it often hastened death, cloaked beneath the illusion of medicine. There were, of course, moments when bloodletting appeared to help. Someone suffering from high blood pressure or congestion might feel temporary relief after losing blood. A fever might break by chance after a session, reinforcing the belief that the cure had worked. These coincidences built a powerful illusion, one strong enough to silence doubt and cement bloodletting as a cornerstone of medicine for centuries. Yet for every supposed success, there were countless silent failures. Patients who grew weaker, who died quietly in their homes, their deaths blamed on fate rather than the cure that drained them. The cultural weight of bloodletting was immense. In many communities, refusing the treatment was seen as foolish or even sinful, a rejection of the wisdom passed down from antiquity. Families pressured their loved ones to comply, fearing the shame of defying a physician's orders. Barber surgeons, working in bustling towns, offered bleeding as casually as haircuts, their shops filled with basins stained by both soap and blood. The red and white striped barber pole, still seen today, traces its origins to this dual role: white for bandages, red for blood. What now seems a quaint symbol was once a reminder of blades slicing veins on a daily basis. The persistence of this practice reveals much about the medieval mindset. It was not malice that drove doctors to bleed their patients, but a desperate need to impose order on the chaos of disease. In a world where plague swept away families overnight, where fevers burned without explanation, the idea of balance offered comfort. If illness could be explained as an excess of humors, then it could also be treated by restoring equilibrium. Even if it killed more often than it cured, it gave people a sense of control over forces they could not understand. What is perhaps most haunting is how long this belief endured. Bloodletting did not vanish with the Middle Ages, but continued well into the modern era. George Washington himself, centuries later, was subjected to repeated bloodlettings during his final illness, losing so much blood that some historians argue the cure hastened his death. The shadow of medieval medicine stretched far, reminding us how deeply entrenched ideas can be, even when evidence whispers against them. And so we are left with the image of a patient, pale and trembling, veins cut open under the glow of candlelight, the physician watching calmly as life drains into a bowl. Around them, the family prays, convinced that salvation is flowing out drop by drop. But in truth, what is leaving is not sickness. It is strength. It is the very essence of survival. And as the bowl fills, so too does the silence, the unspoken realization that the cure has become indistinguishable from the disease itself. A medieval hospital was not the sanctuary we imagine today. Step through its doors and you would not find clean beds, white linens, and quiet hallways, but crowded chambers filled with the smell of sweat, pus, and death. Beds were scarce, and when they existed, they were often shared by 2 or 3 patients at once. The walls, damp with moisture, carried the stench of infection. Rats scurried across the straw-strewn floors, and fleas jumped freely from the sick to the healthy. To enter such a place was to step into a furnace of contagion, where hope was scarce and death lurked at every corner. Hospitals in the Middle Ages were often run not by doctors, but by religious orders. Monks and nuns took in the sick as an act of charity, believing that tending to the suffering was a form of serving God. Their intentions may have been pure, but their methods were deeply flawed. Instead of seeking to cure, these hospitals focused on offering last rites, prayers, and spiritual comfort. Healing of the body was secondary to healing of the soul. A patient admitted to a hospital was not expected to recover, but to prepare for death with dignity. In many cases, the hospital was less a place of medicine and more a waiting room for the grave. Overcrowding turned these institutions into breeding grounds for disease. During outbreaks, the sick poured in by the dozens, carrying plague, dysentery, fevers, and wounds from battle. With no isolation between patients, illnesses spread like wildfire. A man admitted with a broken leg might leave infected with the plague, if he left at all. Entire wards collapsed under the weight of epidemics, with rows of patients lying motionless, their bodies barely distinguishable from the corpses beside them. The line between the living and the dead blurred in these rooms, and it was not uncommon for attendants to discover that the person they had prayed over all night had already passed hours before. The lack of hygiene was staggering. Sheets and clothing were rarely washed, if they existed at all. Wounds were dressed with rags that had been used countless times, soaked in blood and pus. Food was scarce and often spoiled, given more for ritual than for nourishment. Patients lay in their filth too weak to move, while attendants walked among them, spreading germs from one bedside to another. To be admitted to a hospital was not a sign of privilege, but often a death sentence. For many, staying home and relying on local healers gave them a greater chance of survival than stepping into these halls of despair. Yet hospitals were not entirely without value. For the poor, they offered shelter and warmth when no other help could be found. For the abandoned, they provided a place to die among others, rather than alone. In this way, hospitals were as much social institutions as medical ones, offering care to society's most vulnerable. But this care was often more spiritual than physical, more about preparing souls for the afterlife than saving bodies in this one. The prayers of monks filled the halls more than the voices of physicians, and candles burned at every bedside to light the path of the dying rather than to heal the sick. It is telling that many medieval hospitals were built directly beside cemeteries. The transition from bed to grave was a short one, sometimes only a matter of steps. When death swept through in waves, as it often did, carts rolled directly from the hospital doors into burial grounds, carrying bodies wrapped hastily in cloth. For the attendants, this rhythm became routine. Death was so constant that it no longer shocked, and the hospital became not a fortress against illness, but a funnel leading directly into the earth. But even within this grim setting, stories of survival did exist. A patient might leave with a wound miraculously healed, a fever that broke against the odds, or an illness that passed quietly in the night. These rare recoveries were celebrated as proof of divine intervention rather than medicine, reinforcing the idea that hospitals were places of miracles rather than science. The few who walked out alive were held as living testaments of God's mercy, while the countless others who did not were mourned as martyrs of suffering. The design of these institutions reflected their priorities. Wards were often arranged like chapels, with altars at the center, so that patients could attend Mass from their beds. The sound of prayer was constant, the presence of clergy inescapable. To die surrounded by holy rituals was considered the highest form of consolation, and in this way, hospitals fulfilled their purpose. They were not built to cure, but to comfort, to ease the passage of the dying into eternity. And yet, for those who entered seeking true healing, the reality was nothing short of horrifying. The paradox of the medieval hospital is clear. It was both a place of care and of death, of charity and of contagion. Families who brought loved ones into these institutions did so with heavy hearts, knowing they might never return. The hospital was a place of surrender, a final attempt at salvation when all else had failed. And once inside, The patient became part of a grim cycle, lying in bed beside others, listening to the coughs, groans, and prayers that echoed endlessly through the hall, waiting to see if dawn would bring another breath, or the silence of the grave. And as we leave this vision of the hospital behind, the question lingers, if these halls of supposed healing offered little more than death, what hope could remain for those who lived outside them, struggling in villages and towns where medicine was in the hands of men whose skills were as dangerous as the diseases they fought? The struggle between faith and medicine in the Middle Ages was not simply a disagreement of ideas, it was a battle for control over life and death itself. At the heart of this conflict stood the Church, an institution that shaped nearly every aspect of medieval existence. To most people, illness was not caused by bacteria or poor hygiene, but by sin, divine punishment, or demonic possession. In such a world, the priest often carried more authority over the sick than the physician, and for the doctors who dared to practice their craft, every treatment was shadowed by the heavy hand of faith, ready to bless or condemn at will. When disease struck, the first instinct of many was not to seek a healer, but to confess sins, light candles at the altar, or embark on pilgrimages. Physicians found themselves competing with miracles and relics, often reduced to the role of assistants rather than experts. A patient writhing in fever might be prescribed not only herbs, but also fasting, penance, and prayers to a patron saint. The belief was simple. If sickness was divine punishment, then only divine forgiveness could cure it. The doctor's role was secondary, tolerated only when aligned with the spiritual narrative. For doctors themselves, this was a dangerous tightrope to walk. To challenge the Church's authority risked accusations of heresy, but to submit fully meant abandoning reason and observation. Many physicians cloaked their remedies in religious language, presenting their work as an extension of faith rather than science. A bleeding performed to balance the humors might also be framed as releasing sinful corruption from the body. Herbs were prescribed alongside blessings, making treatments appear as holy rituals rather than medical procedures. This delicate performance was often the only way to survive in a world where religion demanded obedience above all. There were moments, however, when the tension exploded. In some cases, priests outright forbade certain treatments, calling them unnatural attempts to interfere with God's will. Surgical procedures, in particular, were frowned upon. To cut into the body was seen as a violation of divine creation, and yet soldiers and peasants injured in battle often had no choice but to submit to the knife. Physicians who practiced surgery worked under suspicion, aware that their skill could save a life one day but condemn them the next. The paradox was brutal. The very act of trying to preserve life could brand a healer as a sinner. The influence of faith extended even into anatomy. The human body was considered sacred, a vessel not to be tampered with. Dissection, which could have advanced medical understanding by centuries, was banned in many regions. Instead, physicians relied on ancient texts, repeating the words of Galen and Hippocrates without question, even when reality contradicted them. It was safer to parrot old wisdom than to present new discoveries that challenged doctrine. In this way, faith froze knowledge in time, locking medicine into patterns of ritual and repetition while silencing innovation. Yet the Church's dominance was not absolute. In monasteries, monks quietly preserved ancient medical texts, translating and copying them for future generations. Some religious orders experimented with herbs and healing methods, blending piety with curiosity. But these efforts often remained hidden or limited, overshadowed by the broader insistence that prayer outweighed practice. For the common man, the priest remained the first and last authority in sickness, and the doctor's role was tolerated only when it did not contradict Scripture. The psychological impact of this conflict was immense. Imagine being a physician called to treat a dying child. You know that rest, nourishment, and simple remedies might give the child a chance. Yet the family insists on pilgrimages, relics, and endless prayers even as the child weakens. To challenge their faith is unthinkable. You would be branded arrogant, perhaps even dangerous. And so you comply, watching helplessly as the patient slips away, your hands tied not by ignorance, but by the iron grip of belief. The weight of such moments must have crushed countless doctors, forcing them to bury their doubts in silence. The clash between faith and medicine also shaped public perception. Physicians were often seen as suspicious figures, their knowledge distrusted when it seemed to contradict the priest's words. A successful treatment might be hailed as a miracle, credit given to God rather than the healer. A failed one, however, was seen as proof of meddling with forces beyond comprehension. The healer became both necessary and suspect, respected and feared, walking always in the shadow of the Church's judgment. This tension produced a society where progress was suffocated. Diseases ravaged entire regions, but instead of studying causes, people looked to the heavens for explanations. Astrological charts dictated when surgeries could be performed. Relics were carried through plague-stricken streets in solemn processions, while doctors stood powerless on the sidelines. Healing became less about the body and more about the soul, less about science and more about salvation. And for those caught between the two worlds, the physicians who saw the truth but dared not speak it. The conflict was not just professional, but existential. It is haunting to realize how many lives were lost to this struggle, how many cures were delayed, how much knowledge was silenced. Medicine could not flourish in a cage built from fear and faith, yet it continued to survive, flickering in secret, waiting for a future where reason might finally be allowed to grow. And as the candlelight of medieval hospitals burned dimly under the shadow of altars and crosses, one question remained. How long could healing remain chained before someone dared to break the bonds that held it captive? To understand the fragility of medicine in the Middle Ages, one must first understand the fragility of medical education itself. Unlike today, where doctors trained for years under structured systems of knowledge, medieval physicians were often shaped more by chance than by curriculum. Some studied in universities, yes, but those universities clung to ancient texts, repeating theories without testing them. Others learned through apprenticeship, standing beside barber surgeons in blood-soaked chambers, copying techniques that had been passed down not through science, but through repetition. And then there were the countless so-called healers, who claimed authority without training at all, selling cures in crowded marketplaces with nothing more than superstition and confidence. The divide between the learned physician and the practical surgeon was stark. Physicians were often educated men, trained in Latin, steeped in the writings of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. They could quote philosophy, calculate astrological charts, and prescribe elaborate regimens for diet and lifestyle. But when it came to the raw, bloody realities of illness, setting a broken bone, amputating a rotting limb, extracting an arrow, they often stepped aside. These tasks fell to the barber surgeons, men of lower social standing, whose education came not from books, but from experience on the battlefield and in the streets. While physicians theorized, surgeons cut, each distrusting the other, yet bound together in a system where neither could fully cure. The apprenticeship model was both practical and perilous. A young apprentice might spend years holding down screaming patients, fetching buckets of water and cleaning tools caked with dried blood. In time, he would be allowed to stitch wounds, pull teeth, and even amputate limbs. But there was little room for innovation, little encouragement to question whether the methods actually worked. If his master used a rusty saw without cleaning it, so would he. If his master believed bloodletting cured fever, the apprentice would carry that lesson forward without doubt, knowledge passed on like a ritual, and mistakes were inherited as faithfully as techniques. Universities, meanwhile, were not sanctuaries of progress, but echo chambers of tradition. A medical student in Paris, Bologna, or Oxford would sit through endless lectures on the balance of humors, memorizing ancient theories that had already stood unchallenged for centuries. Dissection of human bodies, where true understanding might have been gained, was forbidden or severely limited. Instead, students studied diagrams based on animal anatomy, believing them to be accurate representations of the human form. If Galen wrote that the human liver had 5 lobes, students accepted it as truth, even though it had only ever been observed in animals. To question was to risk being branded arrogant, or worse, heretical. This stagnation meant that progress was painfully slow. Occasionally, a scholar might glimpse truth by accident. A surgeon who noticed that washing his hands in wine before a procedure seemed to help a patient survive might adopt the habit, but he would explain it not as killing germs, but as pleasing the balance of the body. Knowledge grew not from deliberate study, but from fragments of observation, hidden beneath layers of superstition and tradition. For every small step forward, there were hundreds of steps backward as old beliefs refused to die. The reputation of physicians was shaped as much by status as by skill. Wealthy nobles sought out university-trained doctors, not because they were more effective, but because their Latin words and expensive robes carried prestige. Poor peasants relied on local healers or barber surgeons, men and women who worked with herbs, knives, and instinct. Ironically, these lesser practitioners often had more success, if only because their remedies were rooted in practical observation rather than theory. A village healer might know that willow bark reduced pain, or that garlic fought infection, not because of books, but because generations had seen the results. Yet these same healers were frequently dismissed, or accused of witchcraft, by the educated elite. The battlefield became a school of its own. During wars and crusades, surgeons gained experience that no university could provide. They learned how to amputate quickly, how to cauterize wounds with hot irons, how to pull arrows from flesh without killing the man who carried them. Yet even here, progress was limited by ignorance. Soldiers often died, not from their injuries, but from infection afterward, as the same tools were used again and again without cleaning. Still, these brutal lessons formed a kind of practical education, one written in blood and screams rather than ink and parchment. For many, medicine was not even a profession, but a sideline. Barbers cut hair, shaved beards, and set bones. Apothecaries sold herbs, powders, and potions, blending medicine with commerce. Midwives delivered children, sometimes more skilled in practice than the physicians who scorned them. Each filled a gap in a fractured system, none fully trusted, yet all necessary. In this chaos of roles, patients often had no clear idea whom to trust, forced to gamble on whichever healer seemed most convincing in the moment. The lack of standardization made outcomes wildly unpredictable. One patient might survive an amputation in one town but die from the same procedure in another, depending on the surgeon's habits or the healer's herbs. There was no shared body of tested knowledge, no agreed-upon method. What worked in one place was dismissed in another, and medicine became a patchwork of contradictions. For the patient, this meant uncertainty at every turn. To seek help was to step into a lottery where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. And so, the very foundation of medieval medicine was unstable. Knowledge was fragmented, training was inconsistent, and superstition outweighed observation. A doctor could be celebrated as wise and learned, yet know less about the body than a farmer who had treated livestock his entire life. The patient, caught in the middle, bore the cost of this fractured system, lying helpless under the hands of men whose education was as dangerous as their knives. As the candlelight flickered across the chambers of these would-be healers, one truth became painfully clear. Medicine in the Middle Ages was not a discipline, but a gamble, built on tradition rather than understanding. And while some clung desperately to ancient texts and rituals, others sought their lessons on the battlefield, in the village, and at the bedside of the dying, each pathway leading to different dangers, and each revealing how far humanity still had to travel before true healing could begin. The battlefield was perhaps the most brutal classroom of medieval medicine. It was here, amid the clash of swords and the roar of cannons, that physicians and barber surgeons learned the cruel realities of trauma care. The villages and towns offered them routine cases, fevers, childbirth, broken bones, but war exposed them to devastation on a scale that no textbook, no ancient manuscript could have prepared them for. Limbs shattered by arrows, bodies pierced by lances, skulls split open by axes. These were not theoretical problems to be discussed in university halls. They were bleeding, screaming realities that demanded immediate, if crude, solutions. When armies clashed, the wounded piled high. After the battle ended, surgeons worked in tents or makeshift huts, surrounded by moans of the dying and the stench of blood. Their tools were simple: saws, knives, cauterizing irons, and buckets of water that quickly turned red. There were no anesthetics to dull the agony, no antiseptics to clean the wounds, no understanding of bacteria to prevent infection. The only priority was speed. To amputate a leg riddled with gangrene or shattered by a mace, the surgeon had to cut quickly, sawing through flesh and bone while assistants held the patient down. If he worked too slowly, the man might die of shock on the spot. If he worked too quickly, the crude cut might never heal. Every decision was a gamble. Cauterization became one of the battlefield's defining practices. To stop bleeding, surgeons pressed red-hot irons against open flesh, searing vessels shut with fire. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, mixing with the cries of men who begged for mercy. In theory, it saved lives. In reality, it often left men crippled, scarred, and vulnerable to infection. Yet, in those desperate moments, with blood pouring uncontrollably from a wound, there was little choice. Fire was the only ally they had. Arrow wounds posed their own unique horrors. Arrows often penetrated deeply, their barbed heads tearing through flesh and embedding themselves in bone. To remove them without killing the victim required both skill and improvisation. Some surgeons designed crude instruments to pull out arrowheads, while others pushed the weapon all the way through the body, causing even more damage in hopes of saving the soldier's life. Many did not survive either method, but some did, and those successes, however rare, reinforced the surgeon's reputation as both butcher and savior. Siege warfare, too, created gruesome injuries that tested the limits of medieval medicine. Stones hurled from catapults shattered bones beyond repair, while boiling oil and flaming arrows left men with horrific burns. The treatments for burns were primitive at best: animal fat smeared on the wounds, or cloth soaked in vinegar to cool the skin. Yet these remedies did little to prevent infection, and burn victims often lingered in agony for days before death claimed them. In such cases, survival was not the expectation but the exception. What is haunting is how these brutal lessons shaped the practice of medicine itself. On the battlefield, surgeons learned not through study but through necessity. They discovered, for example, that wounds left open sometimes healed better than those sealed tightly. Though they misunderstood the reason, it was not bad humors escaping, but bacteria having less chance to fester. They realized that amputating a limb early sometimes saved a life, though the survival rate remained tragically low. Slowly, painfully, and often through trial and error written in blood, they gathered fragments of practical knowledge that would eventually feed into the evolution of modern surgery. The role of the battlefield surgeon was both vital and despised. Soldiers needed them desperately, but society often viewed them as little more than butchers. Their work was bloody, their methods savage, their outcomes uncertain. They lacked the prestige of university-trained physicians. Yet their experience was far more grounded in reality. It was they who held dying men in their hands, who decided whether to amputate, cauterize, or abandon, who witnessed firsthand the thin line between life and death. For all their crude methods, they were often the only chance a soldier had to return home alive. The battlefield also created its own hierarchy of value in human life. Nobles were given priority, treated first and with more care, while common soldiers were often left to die. A knight might receive multiple surgeries and the best available remedies, while peasants were treated hastily or ignored altogether. This cruel inequality reflected the structure of medieval society itself, where even in suffering, class dictated worth. Yet, in the chaos of war, even the highest born could not escape the same risks of infection and death. The blood of nobles and peasants ran together in the mud, reminding all that war was the great equalizer. The psychological toll on surgeons was immense. Imagine spending hours sawing through limbs, cauterizing flesh, and listening to the endless cries of men who knew they would never fight again. Sleep brought no relief, for the screams followed them into their dreams. Some grew hardened, numb to suffering. Others turned to drink or prayer to silence their guilt. A few even began to believe that pain was a necessary test of endurance, a twisted justification for the horrors they inflicted. Whatever path they chose, none escaped unchanged. And yet, amidst this sea of despair, glimpses of progress emerged. The battlefield forced surgeons to adapt, to create new tools, to refine their speed, to observe patterns of survival. These were not discoveries born of laboratories or lecture halls, but of necessity, desperation, and human will. The lessons were crude, yes, but they were steps forward nonetheless. Still, as the fires of war died down and surgeons returned to their towns, their battlefield lessons did not always translate into broader acceptance. The universities continued to cling to ancient texts, the church continued to frame sickness as sin, and society continued to mistrust the men whose hands were soaked in blood. Progress remained slow, stifled by fear and tradition, but the seeds of change had been planted in the mud and carnage of the battlefield, seeds that would one day bloom into a new age of medicine. For the men of that time, however, the future was still far away. All they knew was that the next battle would come soon, the next wave of wounded would arrive, and the knives and saws would once again be put to work. And, for every man who walked away scarred but alive, countless others were left behind. Silent reminders that, in the Middle Ages, the art of healing was inseparable from the art of war. In the medieval world, but to be a physician was to serve not only the sick, but also the powerful. And with that service came immense risk. Nowhere was this more evident than in the courts of kings, nobles, and wealthy patrons, where a doctor's reputation could rise or fall in an instant. Unlike peasants, who had little choice but to accept crude remedies and prayers, the nobility demanded results. They expected their physicians to cure swiftly, decisively, and without failure. But in an age where most treatments were based on superstition, outdated texts, or sheer guesswork, failure was not only common, it was inevitable. And for the physician, that failure could carry consequences far more terrifying than professional embarrassment. Imagine being summoned to the chamber of a powerful lord whose heir lies feverish and near death. The room is tense, the family's eyes fixed on you as though your hands alone carry the weight of salvation. You prescribe bloodletting, the time-honored cure, and drain a bowl of crimson from the child's arm. For a moment, it seems to help. The fever dips, hope flickers, but by dawn the child is gone. In that instant, the same noble family that had looked upon you with trust now sees you as a murderer. Whispers spread through the court. Poison, they say. Treachery. Perhaps you were bribed by an enemy. Perhaps your knowledge came not from God, but from darker powers. What was once faith becomes suspicion, and suspicion in the Middle Ages was often fatal. The higher the patient's rank, the greater the danger for the physician. When commoners died under a doctor's care, it was seen as unfortunate, but expected. Death was everywhere after all. But when nobles perished, it was scandal. Entire dynasties could be shaken by the death of a single child or ruler, and the blame often fell squarely on the physician's shoulders. Some doctors were imprisoned, tortured, or executed after their treatments failed to save important patients. Others lived in constant fear, knowing that a single unlucky illness could end their careers, or their lives. One infamous case often whispered among scholars is that of doctors who attended kings stricken with sudden illness. If a monarch died unexpectedly, suspicion almost always turned toward his physician. Was it incompetence, or worse, deliberate poisoning? Rival factions within the court were quick to seize upon these suspicions, using the doctor as a scapegoat in their struggles for power. In this way, medicine and politics became fatally entangled. A doctor was not only a healer, but also a potential pawn in the deadly games of intrigue that shaped medieval courts. This fear bred caution, but also cruelty. Many physicians resorted to elaborate rituals and displays meant to convince nobles that they were doing everything possible. Astrological charts were drawn, relics invoked, and blood drained in carefully staged ceremonies. Whether or not these actions helped mattered less than whether they appeared convincing. For the physician, survival often depended less on curing the patient than on satisfying the expectations of the powerful. A nobleman's confidence had to be maintained at all costs, even if the treatment itself did little or nothing. Yet even success carried danger. A doctor who cured too many patients too quickly might arouse suspicion of sorcery. In a society that mistrusted innovation, extraordinary results could be seen not as brilliance, but as a sign of dark alliances. Healers who pushed boundaries risked being branded heretics, their skills condemned as witchcraft. In this twisted paradox, both failure and success could lead to ruin. The safest course for many was mediocrity, to repeat accepted treatments, no matter how ineffective, and pray that their patients lived long enough to justify their work. Still, some physicians attempted to navigate these treacherous waters with cunning. They built alliances with powerful patrons, securing protection in exchange for loyalty. Others cultivated reputations as holy men, cloaking their medical practice in the language of faith to deflect suspicion. But even these strategies could collapse in an instant if a noble patient died. The truth was simple. In a world where medicine could rarely guarantee survival, the doctor himself became a convenient vessel for blame. The psychological toll was immense. To walk into a noble's chamber was to feel the weight of invisible knives at your back. Every glance from a lord, every murmur among the courtiers, carried the threat of accusation. Some physicians lived in near constant anxiety, knowing that the fate of their families, their livelihoods, and their very lives rested on forces beyond their control. In this climate of fear, healing became not only a battle against disease, but a battle for survival within the ruthless machinery of medieval power. And yet, physicians continued to serve in these dangerous courts, lured by the wealth, prestige, and influence that came with noble patronage. The rewards could be immense: gold, land, and status that lifted them far above their peers. But the risk was equally great, and many paid the price for failures that no one could have prevented. Their stories remind us that in the Middle Ages, the practice of medicine was never merely about the body. It was about politics, power, and the fragile thread of trust that could snap without warning. And beyond the courts, outside the gilded chambers of nobility, another form of medicine was taking shape, one practiced by apothecaries, midwives, and herbalists, whose remedies were rooted not in power, but in the natural world. Their knowledge, often dismissed by elites, carried both hope and peril of its own, as superstition, tradition, and survival wove themselves into cures that blurred the line between healing and harm. Among the many dangers of medieval medicine, perhaps none were as deceptive as the remedies drawn from the natural world. Plants, minerals, and animal parts formed the foundation of countless treatments, passed down through generations of healers, apothecaries, and midwives. Some of these cures genuinely helped, their effectiveness rooted in properties we still recognize today. Willow bark contained salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin. Garlic offered antimicrobial benefits. Honey, when applied to wounds, prevented infection. But for every substance that carried healing potential, there were dozens more that were ineffective, toxic, or outright deadly. And because there was no true understanding of dosage or side effects, the same remedy that saved one life could just as easily take another. Imagine a patient racked with fever brought to an apothecary's dimly lit shop. Shelves groaned with jars filled with powders, dried herbs, and strange concoctions. Ground emeralds, powdered bones, crushed insects. The healer measured out a handful of leaves, stirred them into wine, and pressed the cup into the patient's trembling hands. If the fever broke, the treatment was hailed as proof of nature's wisdom. If the patient died, the fault was said to lie not with the remedy, but with the will of God, the alignment of the stars, or the sins of the sick. In this way, remedies were never truly questioned, and superstition clung tightly to every dose. Many plants used in medieval medicine carried hidden dangers. Hemlock, deadly in even small amounts, was sometimes brewed into teas for spasms. Mandrake root, prized for its supposed magical properties, was used as a sedative, but in larger doses it caused hallucinations, paralysis, and death. Foxglove leaves were crushed to treat heart conditions, a practice that worked by sheer accident, since the plant contains digitalis, a compound still used in modern cardiology. Yet the difference between medicine and poison lay in a margin far too thin for medieval healers to measure. Without scales, without controlled experiments, they relied on instinct and tradition. One pinch too many could stop a heart, leaving the healer bewildered as to why the gods had chosen not to spare the patient. Animal products added another layer of risk. Powdered ivory, ground deer antlers, and even dried blood were prescribed as tonics. Some remedies involved drinking concoctions of animal dung, believed to draw out bad humors from the body. In moments of desperation, patients submitted willingly, clutching at any chance of relief. To modern eyes, these cures seem grotesque, even absurd, but to the medieval sufferer they carried the weight of authority. If a doctor or apothecary recommended it, who were they to refuse? The trade in exotic ingredients only fueled this dangerous faith. Merchants brought spices, minerals, and rare plants from distant lands, selling them at exorbitant prices to apothecaries who boasted of their miraculous powers. Ground pearls were said to cleanse the blood, while saffron promised to lift melancholy. For the wealthy, the price of these substances mattered less than the hope they carried. For the poor, local herbs and crude imitations filled the gap. In both cases, the patient placed their life into the hands of remedies whose effects were little understood and often fatal. Yet not all was blind faith. Some remedies, though wrapped in superstition, offered real relief. Chamomile calmed stomachs, mint eased headaches, and valerian soothed anxiety. These successes, however, were not recognized as scientific discoveries, but as blessings from God or magic within the plants themselves. The lack of system meant that effective treatments remained mixed with dangerous ones, indistinguishable in the eyes of both healer and patient. Progress was stifled, and the wheel of chance spun endlessly, deciding who lived and who died. What made this reliance on natural remedies so perilous was not only the substances themselves, but also the lack of consistency. Dosages varied wildly between healers. One apothecary might prescribe a few leaves steeped in water, while another demanded an entire root boiled in wine. The results were equally unpredictable. A man treated in one town might survive, while his neighbor in another perished from the same cure. With no standard, no regulation, medicine was as fluid and volatile as the concoctions themselves. The psychological impact of these cures was powerful. Patients often believed in them so deeply that they experienced improvement through faith alone. This placebo effect, though not understood, reinforced the healer's reputation. If someone felt better after drinking a bitter tonic, they credited the remedy rather than coincidence or the body's natural resilience. In this way, belief became as potent a medicine as the plants themselves, though it also made it harder to separate true cures from deadly frauds, and fraud was plentiful. Quacks and charlatans preyed on desperation, selling worthless or dangerous substances to the gullible. Traveling medicine men set up stalls at markets promising cures for every ailment. They offered potions against plague, powders for fertility, and tonics for strength, often mixed with nothing more than colored water or ground chalk. Yet they thrived, because in a world where real cures were rare, the promise of healing was as valuable as healing itself. Those who questioned them were often silenced by the desperate voices of those who wanted to believe. This reliance on plants and animal parts reveals the deeper truth of medieval medicine. It was a system caught between nature and superstition, progress and peril. The natural world did contain remedies, some of which remained part of modern medicine, but the knowledge to use them safely had not yet arrived. Every sip of potion, every pinch of powder, every swallow of crushed stone was a step into the unknown. Some steps led to life, others to death, and no one could tell the difference until it was too late. And as patients lay in their beds, drinking strange brews by candlelight, the dangers they faced from their healers did not end with what was swallowed. For beyond the apothecary's jars and the herbalist's bundles of plants, there loomed an even greater peril, the very structure of the medical profession itself, where power, fear, and desperation twisted the role of the healer into something that could protect as easily as it could destroy. The life of a medieval physician was a paradox, revered by some, despised by others, and always overshadowed by danger. To practice medicine in that age was not to step into the noble role we imagine today, but to carry the burden of suspicion, poverty, and exhaustion, all while surrounded by death. Far from being figures of prestige, many physicians lived short, grim lives, their own survival as fragile as that of the patients they tried to save. One of the greatest dangers they faced was proximity to disease. Physicians worked with no protection, no gloves, no disinfectants. Their hands touched sores, their breath inhaled the stench of plague, and their clothes absorbed the fluids of the dying. In times of epidemic, they were among the first to fall. Entire lineages of physicians vanished in waves of sickness, men who had tried to save others only to be buried alongside their patients. Even the bird-like plague mask that would later become infamous offered little more than false hope, a fragile layer of herbs and cloth that could not stop invisible killers. For every house a doctor entered, he risked carrying death out with him or leaving his own life behind. The emotional toll was no less brutal. Day after day, physicians faced endless cries for help they could not truly give. They prescribed remedies with full knowledge that most would fail. They saw mothers die in childbirth, children wither from fevers, and soldiers collapse from infections no prayer or potion could cure. To know that your work rarely saved, that your treatments often harmed, must have been a crushing weight. Some grew numb to suffering, turning cold and detached. Others drowned in guilt, haunted by the faces of those who had trusted them. For many, their profession was not a calling, but a sentence, a lifetime spent grappling with despair. Financially, too, the physician's life was precarious. Contrary to the image of wealthy court doctors, most practitioners earned little. Peasants could rarely afford to pay, offering food or labor instead of coin. Even when nobles summoned doctors, the reward was not guaranteed. If the patient lived, payment might be generous. If the patient died, the doctor might receive nothing, or worse, be accused of negligence or poisoning. Physicians often lived in debt, wandering from town to town in search of work, their survival dependent on luck as much as skill. The irony is striking. Men entrusted with the lives of others could barely secure their own livelihoods. Suspicion followed them everywhere. In villages, healers were sometimes welcomed, but just as often mistrusted. If a patient died suddenly after treatment, it was whispered that the doctor had meddled with witchcraft. If a physician achieved too many successes, it was said that dark forces aided him. In an age where fear governed belief, a healer was as likely to be burned as a sorcerer as he was to be thanked as a savior. The fine line between respect and persecution was one every physician walked daily, never knowing which side his next step might fall upon. The profession was also physically dangerous. Bloodletting and surgery exposed doctors to constant risk of infection, long before anyone understood what germs were. A cut from a rusty blade while performing an amputation, or even a splash of pus into the eye during wound cleaning, could doom a physician to the same fate as his patient. There are accounts of doctors who fell ill within days of treating plague victims, struck down by the very diseases they had faced so bravely. Their families, too, bore the cost, shunned by neighbors, forced into isolation, blamed for carrying the curse of illness. The healer's work infected not only himself, but also his entire household. The average lifespan of a medieval physician was often as short as that of the people he served. Many did not live beyond their 40s, their health consumed by constant exposure and exhaustion. And yet, despite this, the work never ceased. Demand for doctors was endless, fueled by war, famine, and epidemic. As soon as one physician died, another was called to take his place, the cycle of danger repeating without pause. Medicine itself became a kind of martyrdom, a profession where sacrifice was inevitable and survival uncertain. And yet, for all its dangers, some men still sought the title of physician. Why? Perhaps it was the faint promise of status, the dream of serving kings and nobles. Perhaps it was the desire to wield knowledge in a world dominated by ignorance. Or perhaps it was simply necessity, the lack of other paths in a society where few professions offered even the illusion of security. Whatever the reason, these men stepped into a role that demanded everything and gave back so little, living lives haunted by both the gratitude and the hatred of those they served. The image that remains is one of fragility. Picture a physician walking down a muddy street at dusk, his satchel heavy with knives, herbs, and relics. His robes are worn, his face lined by fatigue. He has just left the bedside of a child who died in his arms, and he is on his way to another home where a mother is in labor, her survival uncertain. Around him, villagers whisper, some with hope, others with suspicion. His own body trembles with fever, a sign he may already be infected by those he tried to heal. And yet he continues, because to stop is to surrender, and surrender has never been an option. In the end, the medieval physician's life was a mirror of the society he served, short, uncertain, and shadowed by fear. Healers stood at the intersection of knowledge and superstition, of faith and science, of hope and despair. They carried both the potential to save and the power to destroy, often without knowing which they had done until it was too late. And as we reflect on their lives, it becomes clear that the true danger of medieval medicine was not only the diseases it could not cure, but the world in which it existed, a world where ignorance, suspicion, and desperation shaped the fate of both the sick and the men who tried, in vain, to heal them. And even as the candlelight of their lives burned out too soon, medicine did not vanish with them. Their failures, their risks, and their sacrifices laid the groundwork for something larger, the slow, painful journey toward modern healing. But that story, born from their suffering, would only begin centuries later, long after their own bodies had joined the countless others in the cold earth.